All right. Well, that was great hearing from Chris Latreille. I'm so excited. He's got such good energy and super inspiring in a lot of ways. So that was super cool. I'm glad that he was able to join us today. So here I am. I'm going to welcome you all here to Speculative Poetry, Writing into the Unknown, which is the second half of Cascade Writers Inspiration Meets Speculation Poetry event. I'd like to invite our guest facilitators to introduce themselves at this time. First, I'll start with Brian and then Brianna, and then I'll jump in to represent Janine Hall-Gailey, who couldn't be here today, and then I'll give a brief introduction of myself. After each introduction, I'll ask you both to share a poem or two that you feel serves as a good example of speculative poetry from your perspective. And then if you could give your own simple definition of speculative poetry, that would be fantastic. It's a little bit of a wrestling with an octopus, I think. So it'll be fun to see what we come up with. For those of you in attendance, take notes and put down questions that come to you all along as you're going along, because these introductions and poems and definitions are probably going to spark something for you. And then we will open up the workshop for all of you to ask questions for these facilitators as we dive deeper into the topic. And the question of what is speculative poetry. And then after that, we'll get into some prompts and writing and maybe even some sharing in the second half of this workshop. So I know I'm looking forward to scratching out some poetry starts that might fit the speculative definition. So let's get going. I'd like to start with Brian. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Share a couple of poems that are speculative in nature, and then give us your definition of speculative poetry.
Yeah, so I'm Brian Garrison, Bug the Writer. So I spend some time with the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. So we spend lots of time talking about these kinds of things. What is poetry and what is speculative science fiction, fantasy, and horror and all that. I've been spending time as the managing editor for the online quarterly journal, Eye to the Telescope, which publishes poetry on a different theme each time, kind of all within that big umbrella of speculative, and also kind of helping out at the SFPA on the tech side of things a bit. My background, I have a bit in neuroscience and brains and that kind of stuff. So a lot of my work kind of blends that science and science fiction. Sometimes the science training comes in a little more heavily, and as I strive to kind of break out into the getting more fantastical and surreal. And sometimes I manage to get a little bit unreal sometimes as well. I have a book from a little while ago called New Yesterdays, New Tomorrows. So I think certainly technology and science and the way that I tend to think about it invites a lot of thought of, when people were kind of confused and learning about what is the makeup of the world, and now things that we just kind of treat as fairly ordinary were strange and something to be figured out. And then my latest book is micro poetry for microplanets. So it tends to be fairly short things, 3 lines. We'll get into a little bit about micro poetry with the workshop. And this one leans a little bit more on that science side of some of the getting into the dwarf planets but also kind of, I think, that underpinning side of like what is science and how do we define, a planet versus a dwarf planet versus some other small rock that's, spinning around out there, and how, a lot of classification is just kind of what humans are doing. So that's my introduction. Should I read the poetry, or do we want to do other introductions?
Yeah, go ahead and give us a couple of examples of what you consider speculative poetry, and share with us, what you think of as a definition,
Yeah.
and we'll go from there.
So lest you think that I only write short things, I have one that's all of, I think, 24 lines, so it's a little bit longer here. But it's called Our Combusted Planet. It's one that was published in January in the magazine Dreams and Nightmares, which is, yeah. So this is Our Combusted Planet. A charming man tried to sell me a gas-powered jukebox, comparing argon and Mercury's green glow to firefly flashes backed by midnight summer branches of spruce and birch. He told me to close my eyes and visualize the perfect night. I remember my first encounter. My 7-year-old self was ready to trade in every electric buzzing, bell chiming, cartoonish arcade game in the world for chirping crickets. Ready to trade in every cartoonish arcade game in the world for chirping crickets and these shooting stars turned bugs. I had returned once to the field as an adult, hoping to respark that supernaturality. I wanted that brief, bright moment against the pitch black curtain. But overbright daylight and the sleepy summer breeze instead only showed me a lonely patch of grass, uncertainly imitating the ocean. Turning the conversation, I asked if he'd heard of the gaslit theaters. Workers who cleaned the candelabras were promised no more chiseling, no more layered mounds of wax, no more dim orange for concert goers. Clear liquid would bring new brightness, a clean burn with brilliant whites, reflected by the oyster-scalloped marble wall insets. Months later, they were scrubbing dark, sooty smears and trashing their blackened glass lantern covers. Fires burned hotter and faster. Ash heaps replaced a whole city quicker than the clicking twist of a pocket watch. Crystal liquids instead of wax and wick were once supposed to be the future. The salesman cleaned his eyeglasses and said, "That was all a long time ago." And I said, "Yes, then why are we still burning?" So in terms of speculative, so that one also kind of reaches a little bit back into the past as well, kind of reflecting on those times when technology was shifting. So again, I think there's science is one way, one perspective on the world that people can kind of go and use certain rules to say, hey, I want to know something about the planet, so I'm going to go look in a telescope and take some measurements. Poetry is kind of another way of starting to think, from just a little bit different perspective and maybe make comparisons that a scientist wouldn't make. So I think in terms of speculative in the way that I play in that world of speculative poetry, sometimes it's a little stretch where you're kind of going a little bit further than what people might have been thinking about, and sometimes it gets a little bit bigger stretch as you start to get into things that are, just a little bit more surreal or a little bit less likely to become a reality. But as we know, science fiction, sometimes the things that the writers talk about wind up becoming the reality. So it gives us time to prepare and think about what can be and can't be. So I'll stop there for now.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Brian. I think that's a good start. I actually really love these acknowledging these connections between the seemingly ordered world of science with the dreamy, perhaps even more chaotic world of poetry. It's sort of, but always trying to get in and narrow in on the truth of whatever one is looking at. So thank you so much for that. What about you, Brianna? Tell us what you're doing these days. Give us a couple of your speculative poems and share with us your vision for a definition of speculative poetry.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay with the mic? Okay. Yeah, so my background is mainly in costume and apparel design. So a lot of research based, a lot of imagery and tactile. And so that really shows in my writing. I mainly write in horror. And so that's kind of what I'll be talking about. And so a little bit about me. I am in the Horror Writers Association. I'm chapter head for the Seattle chapter. I am a staff writer for Monstrous Femme. And yeah, I have a couple poetry collections out. One is called Fashion Trends, Deadly Ends. And that's mainly body horror that's inspired by historical fashion trends over the years. So you can kind of see how my costume design leads into my writing. And so for me, speculative poetry with regards to horror is really about like questioning things and the what ifs. So putting yourself into, what if this house was haunted? You don't, there's not a definitive, this is what ghosts look like, this is what they sound like. And so you're kind of creating your own little world for your readers. And so that's kind of what I think of when I think of speculative poetry, which can also go into science fiction, like thinking about the future and all of those types of things. And so just those situations that you don't have a definitive answer for, you can play around with them and create, new nightmares for people. And so I have a poem. Let me pull it up. So I wrote this one. I did a writing residency last October at the Chateau d'Orquevaux in France. And so this was one that I created because everyone was talking about like, oh, what if this place was haunted? And so I imagined a ghost there. And so this is what came from that. It's called Cries from the Chateau. The stone and brick chateau stands alone on the top of the hill, the floorboards soaked in sadness. Grief lurks around in every corner. The lady in white wails, stoic in the windows, her cries carried off on the wind to the town below. As the fog rolls in, blanketing everything in its path, you may just glimpse a hazy figure in the front window. Waiting for her love to return, she cries, waiting for something that will never occur. Yeah. Yeah. So
Great.
Yep.
No, that's great. I love the sort of atmospheric Gothic quality to that poem, and definitely what if is the big question, right? What if this were to happen? So and then taking it into the sort of darker angle of horror, it does produce a different sort of nightmare scenario that some people really, myself included, really enjoy delving into, just sort of that shadow side of the world. So thanks for sharing that. And I that all makes perfect sense to me. And so I wanted to go ahead and say that though Janine Halgaly isn't here, I've known her for more than 2 decades, and she is the author of several books of poetry, all of them navigating speculative themes that fall inside the arena of things like fairy tales and the fantastic, the dystopian and the mythic. Even superheroes, get equal, space and time with her. So her most recent book is Flare Corona, and I highly recommend that you consult this or any of her wonderful works of poetry, should you be interested in a deeper dive into the speculative. I was going to ask Colin, you could put maybe a slide of the list of her books in the chat so that people can seek her out. I don't have her definition of speculative poetry in hand, but I have a couple of poems that I want to read from her, a couple of her books that I think really capture very much who she is. The first one is from her book, She Returns to the Floating World, and it's called The Foxwife Dreams. And this is a prose poem. The Foxwife Dreams. My husband says, can't trust foxes, their eyes like geodes. The wind brings red fur in my window, and the smell of them clings to my sheets. At the shrine of Inari, he rescued me. I see in his face he will leave me, the foxtail beneath my bedclothes betraying. He swears he didn't know I was Kitsune, though my sharp glances were everywhere, jumping when the dogs bayed. The brown silk robes of my youth, the smell of smashed leaves underfoot wherever I walked, the curl beneath the bed sheets, foxfire, fox flare, fox fur. Our noses were flames in the forest. The light of torn paper lanterns is never true, the moonlight uneven. He always praised my face, the narrow nose, high cheekbones, close set eyes, my hair red even when I brushed it darker. Come sleep with me, he asked, even after. Stay with me. Far away, a fox barking at good fortune. Faithful, faithful, the vixen snaps at his ankles, the taste of rust in the mouths of our charmed children. So definitely Kitsune is a fairy tale from, I believe, Japan, and Janine is really delve deep into those stories. I've enjoyed a lot of that work. And then this piece comes from a field guide to the end of the world, which is one of my favorite books of Janine's. And I'm just going to read it. Post-apocalypse postcard from unnamed island in the Pacific Northwest in the style of Basho. After Appalachian escapees and LA adventures, I've landed here at the northern damp edge of our continent. The evergreens cling to bare dirt, rock, and scrub, a lesson in survival. I've run out of meds, of food, of energy to keep running. I'm in a cabin on the edge of the water. The hawks here have survived, rabbits plentiful here where so little has changed. I think I saw a deer, bare patches on its fur and scrawny, but still it rains and rains. The sea and sky and branches wet and murky. I was watching storms through the glass walls of this abandoned home, all slate shower and granite kitchen, generator and solar coils. There is still heat coming through the floors. From a safer time, I huddle under a stack of old blankets, some of them with children's patterns that make me think, whose? And then there's a well that contains clean water. There are reminders of uncontaminated earth, a flash of movement in the blackberry thicket, a black fox face. I love that. I actually think I know where this poem sort of takes place because I think I used to live nearby there. So, so finally, as your moderator, I'm Tamara Sellman, also a poet, and I only know in hindsight that I've written speculative poetry, but I am the former publisher of the archived anthology Margin, which for 10 years explored literary magical realism. Magical realism and its literary cousins, slipstream, surrealism, the new weird, fabulism, these all fall under the aegis of speculative poetry. So I'm going to share a couple of short poems from Margin, not mine, but from others, which I really do think capture the essence of what can be considered speculative. This first one comes from the US Poet Laureate, Charles Simic. A landscape with crutches. So many crutches. Now even the daylight needs one, even the smoke as it goes up, and the shacks, one per customer. They move off in a single file with difficulty, I said with a hell of an effort, and the trees behind them about to stumble, and the ants on their toy crutches, and the wind on its ghost crutch. I can't get any peace around here. The bread on its artificial limbs, a headless doll in a wheelchair, and my mother, mind you, using 2 knives for crutches as she squats to pee. Charles Simic, always there to give you a little surprise at the end. And then I want to share this wonderful poem from Jelena Miana, who's an international poet. She lives all around. This one has stayed with me for 20 years. It's called The Man Who Folds Crickets. If you give him $1, he'll climb a palm tree, whack a frond to the ground, and meet you back on the sidewalk where he'll begin his folding. The fronds are actually cricket skin. I never knew until that trip to Puerto Rico that all skin must grow on trees like any other fruit, and that there are people who know how to fold it. He sang as he wove the body, organic green fronds twisting, ducking, weaving, giving up the deliciousness of sun for the night songs that would become their lullaby. He left one leg long, attached still to the frond it was birthed of, lest it should hop away before I paid my $1. In the town square, I freed it, snipped the ungainly appendage like an umbilicus that connected it still to the plant kingdom it was plucked from, and watched as it practiced being free. That's a lovely poem. So to me, as someone who has published poetry as a publisher that pushes alternative realism, I would define speculative poetry as forms of verse that strive to move beyond the confines of metaphor into a space that meshes both the magical with the mundane, to show that even if things are probably improbable, that anything can still be possible. So I think that leans in also on the idea of what if, and examining how we look at the world, as Brian pointed out. So at this point, I would like to open up the chat to the audience for any questions you have for any of the facilitators. You can type these in the chat box or raise your hand, which works best for you, and let us know if you are directing your question to any of the specific presenters or if it's just a general question. So anybody have a question or curiosity about speculative poetry, or still trying to wrap your mind around what it is? Anybody? I mean, I have a couple of questions, but I will wait for people to jump in too. Oh, there's a hand. Who's got the hand? That would be Rob. Go ahead and unmute, Rob.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
Excuse me, a little allergy throat here.
Mm.
I think you mentioned, Tamara, that you didn't necessarily know you were writing speculative poetry when you do any of you go into it thinking, I want to write a speculative poem in this genre, or is the poem come first and then it fits in later?
Well, I'll just go ahead and start and just say that I really don't. It just happens. And then I go, oh, well, that's that. And I'm a writer who tends to let the story or the image or whatever inspiration comes through to just be what it wants to be. And so I don't really make those kinds of plans, but I don't know. What do you think, Brian and Brianna? How do you do that? Or do you?
Yeah, I can go. I kind of just let my writing do its thing, and then depending on if I'm trying to find place for it to be published is when I really consider like what actually does this fit into, because sometimes with poetry, at least for me, you can fit into different categories. And so kind of similar to Tamara, I never really realized what I was writing counted as speculative fiction until I started to look into getting published and like, oh, there's horror that's a subgenre in speculative fiction. And then within horror itself, there's all different kind of subgenres too. So just let the writing do its thing first and then go from there.
Yeah, I'll kind of jump in to third that of it. It just kind of depends on where the ideas are coming and where the ideas are going. I don't know that I've done too much trying to like shoehorn something after the fact. I do have a variety of kind of more mainstream stuff that I've had created and published and shared out. And so, I think there's nothing wrong with non-speculative stuff and nothing wrong with stuff that winds up being more speculative. So, I do kind of walk within both worlds. And actually one of the things to the idea of like, well, where does this fit publication wise? Like as I'm looking for places to submit things and sometimes I've seen some horror places and I'm like, well, I don't know that I've got too much that would fit there. And then like looking through my stuff and I'm like, oh yeah, that one's kind of dark, that one's kind of dark, that one's, got like people being dismembered. I don't know that I've actually dismembered anybody in my poetry yet, but yeah, I mean, sometimes it's a surprise to kind of take that look after the fact and see, okay, yeah, there are certain aspects to this or angles that weren't at the top of my mind, but kind of getting that further removed view, certainly some things come into a different focus than when you're there up close, just, figuring out what words and what stories are being woven in there.
That's interesting. Naomi asks, I've always had trouble grasping what speculative poetry is in layman's language. And so one of my questions was whether or not, is it simply just poetry that takes on these common tropes of the speculative? Is it really that simple? Or do you think it's more complex than that? What do you guys think?
I think certainly there's a little bit of room for self-identification. So in the SFPA, we have certain awards where, we can nominate a piece. And I've, at least on one instance where, I encountered a poem that seemed kind of in the realm of science fiction, fantasy, kind of otherworldly kind of stuff going on. And so I was like, oh, I like this. I want to nominate it for the award. And then the person had wound up turning it down. So I think that in as much as someone might be kind of getting out there metaphorical, the way that, Tamara, you were saying, like, here's the metaphor, and then here's kind of maybe inhabiting that world a little bit more within thinking that as the reality. I think it's fine for writers to inhabit just the metaphor and not want to be classified in that way. So just kind of like on a bare bones level, I think of it as, things that are containing what we would classically put on the shelf of science fiction, fantasy, horror, kind of like this weird genre stuff that sometimes people are a little bit hesitant to touch and get, ooh, I'm a genre writer.
So any thoughts from you, Brianna, about that? Whether it's just simply as simple as just putting tropes together, or is it its own beast entirely?
Yeah, I mean, Brian explained it pretty much how I would. And, I kind of with the speculative fiction versus poetry, I think, as long as it's that mythical kind of idea, then you're working with it.
Well, Naomi, I would just say that for me, when I go and look at work, the question, what if, is the very first thing. And I think this is what we've already discussed. The idea that the possibility of something, and it could be just a sliver of unrealness going on there, or it could be just crazy. It could be, ants on tiny crutches, right? And what is the point of going there, but to really like shine a lens on a certain kind of reality that maybe that's overlooked in the normal, ordinary, mundane world, right? That we move through every day, maybe without even looking that closely at it. So the what ifs, or maybe those pauses in time where these poems come out that are really just questioning assumed values and realities, and saying, what if it wasn't like this, or it was like this, or what if this character or this setting took on a different cast, or a different part, a different frequency, who even knows? I mean, you can go into time and space with that too. So to me, it always boils down to what if, and then being playful and taking on things like dualities, like say, the light versus the dark. So you could take something that's usually embedded in a light, environment, like take an angel, say, and then turn that and flip it and show us an angel in an ordinary environment, doing something that's dark, like in the shadows. That might be something that ends up being speculative. So just being playful, I think, is really important. I know I can speak from publishing magical realism that playfulness is really key. It's really important to stretch and push boundaries even, and question what has always been established. And that's a big point for even writing magical realism, is to really subvert expectations for the readers, and maybe even subvert entire power systems, governments and religions and communities where power is concentrated. So a lot of writing actually serves in magical realism, serves to sort of subvert the messaging coming out of those power centers. So that's all a lot to say. What if? So what if you gave people power that didn't have power? What if you freed, the planet from pollutants? What if, you dug up magic rocks and gave them to people who needed the help, instead of putting them in a museum? I mean, I don't know. That's where you go. So it's an exploration, maybe. I don't know if that helps or not, but I'm going to read this from John, because maybe this will help. As the senior poetry editor of two speculative magazines, Abyss and Apex, yay, I love this magazine, and Silver Blade, I consider literary work that has a speculative element, written with literary quality and having literary depth. Answer the why. Should I read this? An example has subtext in human condition, ecology, etc. I totally agree with this. I am currently in a workshop with Richard Thomas contemporary dark fiction. It's not poetry, but there is this huge shift in the way we perceive genre among literary writers, where we're starting to see that there's really not this big division between genre and literary, but rather a piece of work can be both. And that there's maybe a heightened celebration of the art form of the poem that could be a big part of that. So I think that's what John is talking about. And I love that very much. I started out as a literary writer, but I've always read and enjoyed and loved science fiction and fantasy. I mean, Ray Bradbury is my number one, go-to. So the why I should read this and why does it matter, I think, is a big question too. And so I think if you take those things, Naomi, and put those in with that question, what if, that might help you understand the term a little bit better, maybe. So thanks for asking the question. Anybody else have any questions? I know you do. You guys are all experts on speculative poetry, right?
Well, I can dwell a little bit longer on
Yeah.
just some of the definitions. So I think
Yeah.
there is, what's been surprising to me, I think, is how long other writers have been using the term speculative. So with the SFPA, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association, like even going back and reading some of the early stuff from 78 when it was created, like they're throwing this term speculative around. Whereas, a lot of readers might be familiar with science fiction, fantasy, and kind of other, well-known definitions of genres. And I think the way that I've been using speculative is it's kind of just this catch-all to be like, well, I don't really care if it's, going to be on this shelf or that shelf. Like the way that you were talking about, well, is it playing with these tropes? And so like, well, okay, if you've got a unicorn, then you're kind of more typically in fantasy land. If you've got somebody on a rocket, you're kind of over in science fiction land. But like now people want to have unicorns on their rocket ships, and like, well, what is that? Do we need to say whether it goes on this or that, or like, can it all be friends? Like, I'm okay with it all being friends, and that's kind of where speculative is just the like, let's all roll it together. We like writing about these things that are unreal or just, playful, imaginative.
I love that. I like the idea that it's maybe aiming toward more inclusive, structure. And I totally agree that I think so much is being mashed up now that I'm sure it's really hard for publishers and editors to figure out where to shelve these books anymore. But honestly, as a writer, I personally don't care. I am the person that's going to read the story or the poem about the unicorn on the spaceship that's having, sitting in a space where there are melting clocks, I mean, just bring it all, I do think it is a practical question a lot of the time, and speculative, I think it really, if you go into Amazon and you look at the categories of where some books are shelved, they have like so many different categories because it's really hard sometimes to find a speculative piece of writing and know exactly where it fits in the genre world. But I personally am really, I'm also happy and want to be friends and make friends with all of these different tropes, I guess. Some people think of the word trope as, a bad thing. I kind of think of it as, no, it's an expectation that readers have for a certain kind of writing. And when you mash it up, that creates a new cross-genre trope too. And I think there's a lot of readers who are totally digging on that too as well. So I like what Shauna said in the chat. She said, sort of an Anthony Bourdain approach to literature. A fancy pants restaurateur is different from a street vendor. True, but both can be exemplary, true, and mind-blowingly delicious, also true. And Eric writes, it sounds like many of our writers here today do research as part of their writing style. I'd love to know more about how they turn research facts into more abstract poetry. That is a great question, Eric. So what do you think? I mean, Brianna, you obviously you do research. You have a lot of history in your Fashion Trends, Deadly Ends book, which I highly recommend you guys. This is a really, really fascinating book. There's nothing like it out there. So tell me a little bit more about what you had to do, or or your process for taking the facts and history of fashion and turning those into abstract ideas in poetry.
Yes, I love research. Um, just starting with that. So specifically with fashion trends, deadly ends, one of kind of backtracking. So in costume design, when I'm costuming a show or something, I do, depending on the time period, you have to research, want to make sure zippers aren't visible if that's not the time period. And so making sure things are accurate, and then kind of mood boarding and doing that, kind of creating sort of go-to inspiration pages, and keeping those facts in the back of my mind is how I then design for different characters and shows. And one of the things that has kind of bled into writing for me is keeping that sort of research and inspiration. So when I do work on projects, I do create mood boards and everything, and I use those. That way, if I leave the project and maybe I come back 2 months later, I can kind of fully immerse myself once again into that mindset to keep working on it. And so with Fashion Trends Deadly Ends, I knew that I wanted to use different categories. And so the book is head to toe. And so, there's a whole section on millinery, there's a section on corsets, there's shoes, all of those different things. And then kind of picking what I wanted to write about. And so I guess I'm semi old school. I read a lot of books. And so it was, combing through all of my research books that I have for costuming and kind of picking out what silhouettes, and there is a great book I used that I have that kind of depict a lot of, what was wrong with fashion. And so thinking about the chemicals we used in fabric dyes for a long time were poisonous, and we just didn't know. And so, there was a whole slew of different specific colors that if used in the production process were then would cause cancer and things like that. One of the popular things is radium in paint from tiny wristwatches, and the women that painted on the wristwatches would lick the paintbrushes to make them finer, and so they then got radium poisoning. And so that was a whole thing. And so I really, I will compile my images, my facts, and kind of use that to then write about it. And so every now and then something is very specifically inspired. In my book, I think I have 2 that are specifically inspired by real life death. And so kind of using all of that research to just keep me in the zone for what I want to write. But I love research.
I do too. I totally love research, but I like it in a different way because for me, my book that I published called Intention Tremor, it's not speculative really, but it's writing about living with chronic illness. And so I invested a lot of time in learning all of, just for my own self, learning about my illness. And so a lot of that bled into my story, of course, naturally. And what I actually do, it's like really kind of nuts and bolts, is I take these words and I make tons of lists of words, and I try to find ways to use those words in surprising ways that are not just technically accurate, but also suggestive and having multiple meanings. So even the title Intention Tremor, that's the name of a kind of tremor that you can have, but it's also suggests something else, intention. What is your intention? A tremor suggests instability. And so I actually go word hunting literally and writing huge lists. And so the research for me is all about, and then of course, finding the metaphors and the symbols that pop out. Just reading the dry text of research is, to me, it's like a little treasure hunt. So what do you think, Brian? Do you have any research advice?
Yeah, so I mean, from the question, I think certainly reading fiction, like I tend to be kind of caught in the story and explore and learning about that world and paying attention to what the writer is wanting me to write about. I think in researching and just kind of reading nonfiction broadly, I think the way that I approach it, my mind tends to wander a little bit more and kind of expand on, how did someone think to find that out, or what does this mean? Like, is that accurate? Does that sit well with my understanding of the world? So I think for me, reading nonfiction tends to make me kind of ponder and reflect a little bit more, just kind of generally compared to when I'm reading a story that someone else has written. In terms of micro poetry for microplanets, there's the research of going out and seeing, well, what have they measured about the planets in like this really concrete way, and seeing, okay, well, Ceres is so big and it's, minus 110 on the surface. And then there's the one that's way out there, Sedna, it's, minus 260, which is just about, freezing. So or absolute zero, right? So almost, no energy in there whatsoever. So I think there's the really hard facts of what's going on any given dwarf planet. But then too, at the end, my poems are about, okay, well, there's all these other ones that they've got a number but no name. And so like, what does that mean? And what is that in relation to us humans classifying these rocks that are out there swirling? And then one of the other ones that's in there is, about these things that humans haven't even seen. And just kind of inviting you to go a little bit even broader of like, well, we've tagged all these things, we've kind of classified what we know of that's out there, but there's just stuff that is still out there doing its thing, whether or not humans are looking at it or not. So kind of starting from those very specific facts, there's always a way to kind of broaden and take different angles on any specific thing that you're learning about. And that's what kind of drags me to start getting bigger in my
Oh.
my thoughts.
I love that. And answering the questions. I mean, even in history, there's lots in history, especially if you're in a marginalized group, that it hasn't been recorded. And so all you really have is speculation. I mean, I think Toni Morrison wrote a novel, Paradise, which is really about a real town in history that was created after the freedmen moved further west. And she had very little to go on. And so she just created straight from what could happen. So I mean, you can use just those mysteries as a jumping off point. So Clay asked a really good question. He'd like to know more about the process from each of you around editing, polishing poetry. I imagine there are less ironclad rules unless you're doing a specific form, of course. But at the same time, with word economy, literary expectations, etc., there are probably some pretty steep expectations and guidelines to meet as well. So what do you guys think about that? What is your process for editing and polishing your poetry, and what do you worry more about and what do you care less about?
I'll jump in. So certainly, I think anything that I'm writing is interesting to me, or sometimes I come back to it and I think, oh, well, that's not what I want to edit right now. So I think it's kind of that, what is catching my attention and kind of wanting to maybe dive a little deeper, maybe find kind of more interesting ways of putting it. Sometimes it's this matter of kind of, seeing a word and thinking, well, that's kind of plain. What can I do to put a more interesting word or describe it in a way that is a little bit more metaphorical? And then also just to, give a shout to having other people that can read your work and give you that input. So certainly, my perspective is one thing, and whether that's just kind of finding somebody else being able to find where I was a little bit clumsy and I'm kind of fixing it in my head, or that's, my clumsy way of putting it at the time. Or also kind of, being able to say, well, this doesn't really make sense, or being able to point out a way of like, oh, this would be interesting to like go a little bit further here. So having people that are willing to read your stuff and look it over and give some additional insight is just a great way to push yourself further. and be part of the community.
So for me, I don't know if this is bad or not, but I tend to handwrite my poetry, and when I type it is when I edit it, and I'm the visual aspect of how it looks on the page is really important to me. And so that is when I do my editing, when I type it. And then 90% of the time, that's it for me. I don't really go back and touch it unless I'm looking for something very specific. And then maybe if I have a piece that I want to submit somewhere and it almost fits but doesn't quite fit, maybe I'll play around with it. I'll make a separate version. I'll still keep the original. But that's kind of it for me on the editing process.
Not bad. I kind of do the same thing. So, or maybe it is bad, and we're just bad examples. I don't know. But
Yeah.
I write more than one thing. I mean, so I write fiction, I write poetry, I write nonfiction. And so for me, I don't want to know why my poetry works. Seems so weird. But to me, writing fiction or prose in general, there are structures and so many rules, and I just am happy to impose those. But when it comes to poems, I kind of just want to go with my gut. And so I often also write poems by hand, but even if I write them on the laptop, I'll set it aside and then I'll come back to it. And I tend to impose forms on my poems if they don't seem to work for me. If I feel like there's something missing, I might throw in. One of the things I do a lot is I use syllabic. So I often naturally have these poems that all count 8 beats each line, and I don't know why. It's just like a natural rhythm that I have. So sometimes I'll look at, if something's not right, I'll look at the syllables in each poem and go, oh, so it's mostly 8s or it's mostly 9s, but there's a 7 here and there's a 12 here or whatever. And then I'll kind of use that as a way to maybe force myself to choose different words or images, or find the turn in the poem in a different way, and looking at literally how it looks on the page, as you were saying, when you type it in, and where you do the line breaks and all of that. So a lot of it is just about the actual presentation of it on the page, and where it makes sense for me. But I'm also kind of the same. I just kind of go through it. I don't spend too much time because I feel like you can just like revise the air out of a poem, and then it's just like, there's nothing, no life left in it. So that's a really good question. Hopefully that answered your question, Clay.
Can I say
go
just
ahead.
a little more on that too? Because one thing that
Yeah.
comes to mind, I don't know that I've ever been very good at it, but sometimes it's a matter of like envisioning who's the one individual reader. And so part of the question came about, expectations kind of from, whether the journal or literary expectations. And I think part of the clarity of writing is not having that over your head, like a guillotine ready to kind of slam down and remove anything good. And it makes me think of hearing from Bill Watterson, the creator of Calvin and Hobbes, and like it's one of my all-time favorites. I grew up with it, read it as a kid, has a special place in my heart. But his technique was primarily, well, I wanted to make my partner, enjoy what I was creating. And so, that's one example of kind of having that one specific person that you're creating for, and it helps it to be a little bit more anchored in, this is my reality. This isn't the godly thing that's being handed down from on high. This is, just one slice of one person's life. That's all any story can be.
That's a really good point. And I think at the end of the day too, when it comes to revision, it's really about your voice too, and you're just the way that you see the world. And if you can stay true to that, I think that does a lot of the work. And I think the expectations thing, it kind of leads into another question, because it has to do with the reader. It has to do with publishers too, because I think most of us are writing poetry that we want to put out in the world so other people can read it. It's not only for ourselves, although I think maybe we all start at the place of writing for ourselves, which I think is healthy. But Jenny asks, when you're looking at potential markets for individual poems, what do you take into consideration and how do you weigh those factors? Thinking of things such as market's reputation, history, response time, compensation, AI policy, and all of that. And I'll just make it a really quick answer is that I just take it one by one. I go and I want to make sure that it's the right fit for a particular magazine. And that means you have to read the magazine and kind of look in there. And that means we should all be really reading poetry magazines or poetry in magazines and journals, wherever we can find it. So I feel like, response time is a big one for me. I don't like to wait, 2 years to hear back. I mean, 3 months I think is reasonable. As a former publisher myself, I mean, we used to get tons and tons, but we would always turn everything around within 3 months. And we were a very skeleton crew kind of staff, very few of us. So, but it's important because writers, and then also having the policy of simultaneous submissions being okay, because people could wait for years and years and never hear back, and that's really frustrating. So, but I also think it depends on whether you or not you want to get paid for your poems too. Certain markets, you might have to wait longer, but the payout might be better. It might be more reputable and better for, the nicer feather for your cap and all of that. So I think it really depends on why you write poems. So I don't know, what do you guys think about when you market your poems? What are the things that you look most closely at?
For me, a couple of the things. One, can it be a simultaneous submission? I keep all of my submissions in a spreadsheet, so I know what's going where, what the response time should be. Am I allowed to send it multiple places, pay rate, all of that. But I look at, would I want to be published with them? Do I want to be associated? So making sure I've read their stuff, I would be a good fit. I know who their readers are. I'm at that point where I do want to get paid. So I don't do a lot of free stuff unless it's somebody I know. And that's just a personal preference. When I started out seeking publication, I just kind of wanted to be involved in stuff. And so I accepted, just getting a copy of what I was in. So that's kind of just been over the past couple of years, my preference has changed. But I really like to submit places where it has 3-month or less turnaround and you can have simultaneous submissions, just in case I forget I've submitted something somewhere. That's just makes me a little bit more relaxed in the submission process. So.
Yeah, so certainly there's going to be a lot of rejections, so one way or another. So over time, I have moved more toward, like Brianna is saying, with wanting to submit to places that are going to pay a little bit, or that have a little bit more respect. Now that I've been kind of in the industry for a bit, getting some of those helps me to move up into some of the ones that are paying and paying more. So building from ones that aren't paying, can be a way to kind of get some credits and build some confidence. And now, like, I will sometimes, pass some of the things that have been rejected by other places to places that maybe only pay in a contributor copy, or if I know the person through the SFPA or otherwise, that, like, I've seen some of the work they're doing and want to help support that this magazine is an up and coming thing. So yeah, it's one of the things I also want to say is that I feel like I do a lot of my reading while I'm looking for places where I want to submit. So again, kind of speaking to that, reading and understanding what the journal's ethos is, what kind of the feel is, and then looking through the list of what I've got and what might fit there. I don't do a lot of, like, writing things specific to what's going to suit the needs, so much as it's kind of a matter of seeing, well, what am I doing and who are the other people that are out there kind of thinking in similar ways, or offering a place for the kind of stuff that I do.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I belong to Duotrope, and I will always check the upcoming deadlines when they have themes, because Sometimes not because I'm going to write to them, but those are like such sparks. I mean, they offer such sparks for new writing. So sometimes I will do that, and I'll look out a few months and say, "Ooh, I do want to do something for that." And then I'll put that in the back of my head, and then it eventually leads to writing something new. And, we're always looking for inspiration and motivation to keep going. So Carrie Lee has a really good question. A lot of speculative poetry I've read is free verse. I think I've seen form mostly in the vein of sci-fi quest short forms. That's a hard word. Sci-fi coup, which is, haiku, that's sci-fi. For all panelists, do you prefer free verse or form? And how do you feel one or the other is more effective for you when working in the speculative? I love that question. What do you guys think?
I personally really like free verse. I've tried my hand at rhyming sometimes. I've tried my hand with making sure the meter's the same, all of that. But for me, I think it just works better for getting the words out to do it in free verse. And I know everyone's writing style is different, but I prefer free verse. But I do try every now and then, just as a challenge, to make something fit a specific form. But I like the idea of kind of no rules with poetry and writing speculative, because to me, there's also no rules in speculative. So it just kind of clicked.
Yeah, it's going to depend kind of per poem, certainly. But when I was starting out, I used to feel more like I was kind of struggling to pick out the right words. Like if you took a box and put like 3 puzzles into it and kind of shook it together, and then like I felt like my writing was kind of sorting through and then being like, okay, I think this one kind of fits here. Maybe this one is part of the poem. And one thing that helped was kind of getting connected into a place where it's like, okay, here's some prompts, just write for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and like just keep the pen moving. And having some success with that, I think kind of helped free the words to kind of flow out how they are, and then kind of figuring that out later in terms of how it's going to fit. And so that way of creating something new, of generating something from kind of more just, hey, put words down on the paper. I certainly haven't mastered the way of, turning that into a sonnet or something. So being able to let the free verse be its own flow, certainly that way of generating work lends itself to winding up as free verse. One of the other things that I've done is a bit of writing for kids. So that tends to invite, looking for, rhyming and bouncing and, done a bit of limericks, right? So that's another, it's 5 lines instead of 3 lines compared to a haiku, but kind of trying to, spin the words in your head and then like, okay, that sounds like a reasonable line. And then, you put that down and then you put down the next one. Then like, oh, well, maybe this other line needs to be revised. So it does start to get it again a little bit more into that, like, okay, well, now I'm weaving very specifically or taking out the pieces of the puzzle. But yeah, I think in terms of free verse, I think, is what I tend to have more come out when I'm just more naturally kind of toying with an idea.
I think I start with free verse too, but as I'd said earlier, I'd like to impose a form of some kind. And I've also found that I tend to like to experiment. I like to just like blow up something and try something brand new all the time. So I've done rondeaus, I've done blitz poems, I've done ghazals. There's some other forms. And it's really interesting what can come out of those. So sometimes if I'm, again, if I feel like I'm bored with a poem, but I know that there's a spark in there, I might force it into that, because then it creates these new conditions. And then, this is like science, right? Or chemistry, you throw things in together and in different amounts and in different conditions or environments, and you get these new things that, come, and that can be super exciting. So I love the idea of a puzzle too, because I think poems are also, or any kind of creative work can really be a puzzle where you're taking those different things that are at odds and throwing them to a shoebox and shaking it up. I love that. And I think that's where the real sparks can happen. So I agree with that. So John says in the chat, a poem will seek its own form as water seeks its own level. I totally agree. Free verse, he says, is a misnomer because it has a lot of form, especially with line breaks. The best thing free verse has given us, which is absolutely true, line breaks. And formal poetry can always be subverted. I agree with that. I think that's one of the fun things you can do is you can break a formal poem too, where the structure and purpose is maintained, but meter and rhymes can be abandoned. So end of line rhymes. So and then so we're going to do one more question, then we're going to start writing some poems. So Fritz writes, how long does it take you to write one poem? Do you work on one piece at a time, or do you have a lot of projects going at once? I write, I'm just going to make this really fast because I mostly am writing prose these days, but I slip it in and out. Sometimes a poem just demands to be written and I'll just put it down and it'll be a crappy little first draft or zero draft even for months and months, and then I'll get back to it. So I often spend more time revising just little bits and shreds, maybe not so different than Chris Latre and his single sentence things every day. It doesn't take me long to start a poem, but it might take me some time to get to it and revise it. So what about you guys?
So certainly, I've got my scraps of paper and scraps of digital scribblings of like, hey, this is something that I might want to play with later. Or just a line or two that kind of sit around and linger. And maybe I'll go back through and be like, oh, wow, that sounds really cool. I should come back to that. So sometimes, it might be months or years before some idea becomes a final thing. As I've become a little bit more well practiced and, kind of finding more slivers of time that I'm like sitting down and saying, okay, well, I've got this list of ideas. Now I want to turn that into a poem. So I want to take this one and, it can kind of sit down and churn out a first draft in 20 to 45 minutes. But yeah.
Yeah, so similar to what Tamara said, if it's just an idea and I'm in the zone, it's very short, just write it down. And then maybe later going back in the typing process and kind of like, oh, I really want this line to be up here. Like that's where it'll take me a little bit longer. If it's a specific project that I'm working on, like a collection of poems, sometimes, maybe I'm just not feeling it and stuff can take quite a bit. Otherwise, it's relatively quick for me, but then they just kind of sit in my notebook or on my computer until I need them for something.